Today, we will explore 12 eerie locations in Louisiana where the line between history and the supernatural thins until it almost vanishes. From moss-draped plantations beside slow rivers to narrow alleys behind old French Quarter facades, these places carry stories that some swear are not finished. In each stop, we will lay out the history, share eyewitness testimony, describe the sensations people felt, and explain what the sights are like now. You will hear about cold spots that seem to breathe, about mirrors showing faces that do not belong to anyone alive, about footsteps that continue after the room falls silent. What makes a place truly haunted? Is it a record in an old newspaper, the steady testimony of a neighbor, or the single moment when a stranger felt a presence and could not explain it? Stay with us and you will decide for yourself. Prepare to walk through 12 stops, each with its own chapter of memory and rumor. If you love mysteries, leave a like now and let us begin. The Myrtles plantation sits under a canopy of live oak trees whose hanging moss blurs the sun into pale curtains. The white columns still show scars of paint and of storms, but the story that follows is older and darker. Backstory. The plantation was established in the early 1800s, and over the decades it changed hands and fortunes between owners who cultivated cotton and sugar. The family records tell of births and deaths recorded with the same ink and of ledgers that detail sales and debts. In one winter, a fever swept the region and several members of one household died within days. A combination of misfortune, sorrow, and rumor produced a portrait that later travelers would call a ghost. A servant woman accused of a crime was said to have been punished and was later blamed for a string of misfortunes. Some of these accounts were published in local papers in the late 1800s, and archived affidavits from neighbors mention candles at night and a white dress seen near the river. Those documents anchor the legend in time and community and help explain why, for generations, visitors reported cold spots and the feeling of being watched. Conversation. Marie, the innkeeper, said, "I heard someone call my name late at night. I thought it was Kevin, the groundskeeper, until I saw the hall empty." Kevin replied, "I checked the hall, lights were off and the front door latched." Marie said, "The air smelt like old roses and something metallic, like copper." Kevin said, "I felt a light touch on my shoulder, but when I turned, no one was there." Marie said, "We both smelled wood smoke, though no fire burned." Sensory details. The smell of damp earth and old roses lingered. The floorboards creaked underfoot like slow heartbeats. A faint piano note seemed to hang above the parlor, though no instrument played. The air went cold, a wind that did not pass through the windows. Stay today. The property is open for tours, and some guests report hearing a cradle rocking at night. Guides like Thomas and Rosa lead candlelit walks and point out back mirror that locals call a trouble mirror. In the French Quarter, an old townhouse that once housed a merchant is now associated with the story of a woman in a white dress who vanished into the nighttime rain. The house was built in the 1830s and has narrow stairs that sigh with each footfall. History here folds into the fabric of the neighborhood. Backstory. Brief records show the house belonged to a shipping family whose daughter fell in love with a traveling sailor. The courtship ended in scandal and an elopement attempt that failed. One rainy night, she was seen at the doorway in a white dress and then gone. Local letters to the paper mention a missing will, a chest of letters, and a strange entry in a ledger suggesting someone hid money in the walls. Over time, neighbors added their own sightings, and a succession of maids and porters told similar tales. Conversation. Claire, the bartender, recalled, "I was closing up and heard a soft humming behind the bar." Marcus, a neighbor, said, "I saw a pale silhouette at the window." Claire said, "She raised a hand as if to wave." Marcus said, "But when I opened the door, there was only rain." Claire said, "The tile smelled of lemon and damp wood." Marcus said, "For a moment, the whole block smelled like old perfume." Sensory details. the warm oil of frying food from a nearby kitchen mixed with the cool damp on the street. Lantern light pulled like honey on the cobbles. Voices echoed off shutters like a distant chorus. Hands brushed the banister and left a faint chill. State today. The townhouse operates as a private residence, sometimes open for heritage tours. Local guides like Henry sometimes bring small groups after dusk. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 holds vaults stacked above ground and names carved into marble. Some inscriptions are crisp, others worn to ghostly smudges. Backstory. The cemetery dates to the early 1800s and served as the final place for many families who shaped the city. Its unique burial practice, above ground, was practical and became ritualized over time. Among the vaults is a family crypt that records a death in winter 1853 and a sudden illness that took 3 siblings in quick succession. Local accounts and a doctor's bill preserved in an archive suggest the community mourned together and then tried to move on. However, over decades, visitors reported a woman lamenting by one particular tomb and the sound of shoes scraping marble. Conversation. Guide Elijah said, "I have led dozens of visitors here at night, and one year a man pointed to a vault and said he felt someone breathe on his neck." Linda, a historian, said, "I found a ledger entry mentioning a funeral prayer left with flowers." Elijah said, "I saw shadow move between the crypts," Linda said. "The stone smelled of lemon and dust," Elijah said. "A cool breath passed and my flashlight flickered." Sensory details. The scent of lilies and incense mixed with the dry dust of old stone. The echo of footsteps became precise as a metronome. A distant bell chimed, and the air tasted faintly of metal. The marble underhand felt cool and strangely damp. State today. The cemetery is guarded and tours are regulated. Local caretakers like Marcus and Claire caution visitors to be respectful and say that some vaults are closed to the public. The LaLaurie residence is a townhouse whose windows have seen too much rumor. The building stands near busy streets, yet seems to keep a hush. Backstory. Official records show the house belonged to a family of prominence in the early 1800s. Court cases and advertisements in newspapers record servants employed and transactions made. A scandal erupted in the 1830s, and the name attached to the house was later recorded in legal files and in moralizing articles that spread across the region. The mix of documented complaints, a few police notes, and many unverified oral histories created a narrative that haunted the neighborhood. Conversation. A local archivist named Henry said, "I read the old petitions from neighbors." Marie, a docent, said, "People would not walk past the house after dark." Henry said, "Even when the streetlights were bright." Marie said, "You could feel a pressure each time you passed." Henry said, "Once a visitor said she smelled fresh bread, then felt a push." Sensory details. The smell of baking from a closed window seemed so real you could be fooled. The shutters rattled as if someone paced. The taste of dust was sharp in the mouth. A low thump sounded above, like footsteps pacing. State today. The house has changed uses and faces, but the name carries weight. Tours mention the history and caution onlookers about quick shadows reported by passers-by. At an old plantation called Willow Hollow, the river bends near a stand of cypress, and locals tell of music drifting on fog nights. Backstory. Willow Hollow began as a working farm in the mid-1800s and later served as a gathering place for seasonal dances. A ledger lists payments to a fiddler and a piano tuner, and a small box in a museum archive contains a blue ticket from a harvest ball. The social life and the tragedies of those years mixed so that the sound of a piano now conjures both celebration and sorrow. Conversation. Guide Marcus said, "On foggy nights, people stop and listen to music that is not there." Claire said, "I once stood on the porch and heard a slow waltz." Marcus said, "I felt wetness on my cheek like river spray." Claire said, "But it was not raining." Sensory details. The fog carried the cool scent of river mud and algae. The feel of damp fabric clinging to skin was unmistakable. The echo of a single piano note lingered like a dropped coin. The moonlight painted the water in silver ribbons. State today, the plantation offers evening walks and storytellers like Rosa play recordings and also document visitor reports of phantom music. A narrow hotel in a river town kept the name of a family that ran it for decades. Guests report a woman humming in an empty hallway and shoes that continue down the corridor after the house goes quiet. Backstory: the inn was built in the late 1800s and advertised meals and rooms in a regional gazette. Family letters show 3 generations kept the ledger and occasionally noted odd disturbances. A 1912 entry mentions a guest who would not sleep and who left for another town at dawn. The sustained memory of one restless traveler combined with other odd notes to build the inn legend. Conversation: the innkeeper Linda said, "I once checked the guest list and all rooms were accounted for." Marcus said, "Then I heard the sound of heels on the second floor." Linda said, "I called out, 'Hello?' Marcus said, there was no reply." Linda said, "The scent of talc and old polish filled the hall." Marcus said, "My hand brushed a doorknob and it was colder than the air." Sensory details: the hallway smelled like old soap and brass polish. Light from a lamp pulled on patterned wallpaper. The carpet muffled steps but made a whisper when someone walked. The cold spot sat at the landing like a held breath. State today: the hotel still hosts travelers, and the staff notes that some guests book the old room hoping to experience something unusual. A small coastal cemetery near a levee bears the names of fishermen and children and a marker with a date of a sudden storm. People say a lantern floats above the graves on fog nights. Backstory: the burial ground began as a simple plot for families whose lives tied to the river and the bayou. A county ledger notes a storm that capsized a small fleet and listed names of the lost. The community erected a stone marker and sang hymns by lantern light for a week. After that, the story of the lantern began to surface in letters and at wakes. Conversation: neighbor Thomas said, "I saw a light bobbing above the graves." Claire said, "I thought it was a boat." Thomas said, "But there is no water at that spot." Claire said, "The air smelled of salt and rope." Thomas said, "I felt the leather of rope under my palm, though there was none." Sensory details: the smell of brine and rope, the rough texture of weathered wood under your hand, the sound of gulls in a far distance, and the taste of iron in the mouth when the wind shifted. State today: locals leave small offerings at the marker and employ a caretaker named Elijah, who notes occasional sightings. An abandoned schoolhouse on a rural road keeps desks that creak and a chalkboard stained with old lessons. Backstory: the school closed in the 1950s after consolidation, and the last teacher packed away attendance books and a few lesson plans. Local interviews preserved in a small historical society file describe a child who went missing decades ago. The memory of that loss attached itself to the empty building and to the swing in a nearby yard. Conversation: teacher Claire said, "I kept the old register for years." Marcus, a former student, said, "We used to dare each other to run past the windows." Claire said, "When I returned, there was a faint whispering." Marcus said, "We opened the door and the air inside smelled like chalk and something sweet." Claire said, "The chair moved, though no wind blew." Sensory details: the dust hung like a light fog in sunbeams. The smell of chalk dust and old paper rose when the door opened. The wooden floor complained underfoot. A soft giggle seemed to come from the corner. State today: the building is gated, but locals, including Linda and Thomas, sometimes bring students for history projects and report unexplained knocks during evening visits. A plantation chapel with stained glass windows, once used for weddings and funerals, is known for a reflected face in a mirror that no one can account for. Backstory: records show the chapel served a broad community and that a certain wedding in 1899 finished with a sudden illness in the groom. The family ledger shows payments and a small note about a misplaced locket. The chapel later served as a meeting place for grief counseling and town gatherings. The mirror that became part of the legend was installed in the 1920s and was a gift from a parishioner. Conversation: parishioner Marcus said, "I put my hand to the glass and felt a presence." Rosa, a volunteer, said, "I saw a face in the reflection that was pale as milk." Marcus said, "When I turned, there was no one in the pews." Rosa said, "The smell of incense swelled, then dropped." Marcus said, "The light bent strangely on the glass." Sensory details: the resin of old candles perfumed the air. The floor smelled of beeswax and steamed wood. The sound of a hymn echoed from the empty organ. Like velvet, the silence pressed against the ears. State today: the chapel is used occasionally, and caretakers like Henry keep the mirror covered until special services. A long, empty mansion at the edge of a small town is marked by a willow at the gate and by reports of footsteps pacing a balcony at dawn. Backstory: the mansion belonged to a merchant family who faced bankruptcy and a public auction in the 1920s. Local papers detailed the transfer of goods and the odd removal of a portrait. The name of one son appears in a probate file, and a notation mentions a locked upstairs room. After that, the house passed through owners and slowly emptied. Neighbor Linda said, "I wake to the sound of pacing each morning, Marcus," a teenager said. "I watched the balcony and saw someone move," Linda said. "I called out, 'Who is there?' Marcus said. The shutters moved, though no wind blew," Linda said. "The smell of cold smoke lingered." Sensory details: the willow leaves whispered like soft hands. The porch boards held the faint stick of gumshoe leather. The air tasted of old tobacco and river mud. A distant clock sounded, though the town clock was silent. State today: the mansion is fenced and monitored, and a local preservation group led by Claire sometimes opens it for rare daytime tours. A small theater downtown with red velvet seats, closed and reopened multiple times, hosts stories of applause after the house is empty. Backstory: the theater opened in the early 1900s and later became a venue for traveling acts. It had a resident pianist who tuned nightly and a stagehand whose name appears in payrolls over decades. When a fire threatened the building a few decades back, the community rallied and saved the facade, but some old roles remained unfinished. Conversation: Janitor Thomas said, "I stayed late and heard someone take a bow." Henry, a longtime patron, said, "I once sat alone and heard clapping." Thomas said, "I called out hello before I left." Henry said, "The scent of grease paint rose, then faded." Thomas said, "The curtains shivered, though no draft came." Sensory details: the velvet felt warm, then cooled under the palm. The smell of popcorn and dust layered together. A high note seemed to hang in the balcony. State today: the theater functions as a community stage, and actors like Marie report sudden chills during rehearsals. A narrow lane behind an old hospital leads to a small garden where nurses once walked and where a lone swing still moves at night. Backstory: the hospital was built in the late 1800s and served the county through epidemics and wars. Staff led prayer meetings and kept detailed journals. A nurse mentioned in those journals is remembered for staying with dying patients by lamplight. The garden was planted in her memory and later became a place for staff to smoke or rest. Conversation: Nurse Rosa said, "I often sat in the garden and felt someone sit beside me." Marcus, a former orderly, said, "One night I found the swing moving." Rosa said, "I told the story and others said they felt the same." Marcus said, "The scent of herbs rose and a faint linen smell came through." Rosa said, "I touched the bench and it was damp." Sensory details: the herb scent of rosemary and lavender mixed with antiseptic. The wooden bench held a cool dampness. The small path crunched underfoot with dry leaves. The night air felt sticky and close. State today: the garden is maintained by hospital staff and sometimes used for quiet remembrance. If any of these stories made you shiver, you are not alone. Next part is for you. If one of these accounts made the hair on your arm stand up, tell us in one word which one caught you most. If you have been to a similar place, start your comment with "I saw," followed by one line about what you experienced. We read every single comment, and your brief notes help others find nearby stories and sometimes lead to follow-up interviews with eyewitnesses. Your memories could connect to someone else who has a matching detail, and that is how a collective memory is pieced together. Thank you for sharing. Now we move on to the last handful of locations where guides and investigators gathered recordings and notes that are hard to ignore. As we close this tour, remember that history is not only found in documents. It lives in the poorest moments when people notice an odd scent, a face in a mirror, a light blinking in empty rooms. We visited 12 locations where the past shows up in the present, as stories and as sensations. Some sites are open for tours and have guides like Thomas, Marie, Linda, Marcus, Claire, Henry, Elijah, and Rosa who document and welcome visitors. Others are guarded or private and remain part of neighborhood talk. Either way, these places connect legal records, family ledgers, and newspaper clippings to the human experience of encountering something unexplained. We offered backstory for the sites and listened to residents and witnesses whose voices add weight to the tales. We also noted that some accounts have mundane explanations while others resist easy answers. If you were moved by a single story, tell us which one to investigate next and sign up to see deep dives with interviews and archival research. We aim to treat these narratives with respect and curiosity and to return with cameras and experts when you ask. For now, hold the image of a lantern floating over graves, the echo of a piano that will not stop, the cold press of a hand where no one stands. Those images stay with us longer than any tour and remind us that memory can be as persistent as the bricks and stones of a town. When you walk home tonight, listen for footsteps that are not yours, and remember that sometimes the history around us will not stay quiet. Subscribe for more investigations and share this video with someone who loves stories that mix archive and encounter. Until our next visit, remember this line of thought. Walls remember what we forget, and sometimes they speak back in whispers.